The sun hung low over Salvation Ridge like a blood-soaked coin, casting long shadows across the weathered planks of Main Street. It was the kind of evening that made men nervous, the kind that whispered of change coming on the wind. The town had earned its name honestly enough, built by folks fleeing their pasts, seeking redemption in the harsh embrace of the frontier. But redemption, as the old-timers knew, was a fickle thing, and Salvation Ridge had secrets buried deeper than any mine shaft in the surrounding hills. On that particular evening in August of 1887, a lone rider approached from the Eastern Trail, his silhouette cutting a hard line against the dying light. He rode a black stallion, its coat gleaming like polished coal, and he sat in the saddle with the easy confidence of a man who'd spent more nights under stars than under roofs. His face was hidden beneath the wide brim of a dusty hat, and a dark kerchief hung loose around his neck, ready to be pulled up at a moment's notice. The townsfolk who noticed him paid little mind. Strangers were common enough in Salvation Ridge, drifting through like tumbleweeds, rarely staying long enough to matter. But this stranger was different, though none of them knew it yet. This stranger had a name that would soon enough set their world ablaze. They called him Cain Blackwood, though that name itself was as much a mask as the kerchief he wore. And Cain Blackwood had come home, though home was a word that tasted like ash in his mouth. He guided his horse down Main Street at an unhurried pace, his eyes taking in every detail behind the shadow of his hat brim. The general store still stood on the corner, though it had been repainted since he'd last seen it. The saloon, the Lucky Dollar, still had its swinging doors and the sound of an out-of-tune piano bleeding into the street. The bank, solid and imposing with its brick facade, sat like a fat spider in the center of the town's web. And there, at the far end of the street, the sheriff's office with its barred windows and hitching post out front. Everything was familiar and foreign all at once, like a face you once knew that time had reshaped. 23 years. That's how long it had been since Cain Blackwood had last walked these streets, though he'd been called something else then. He'd been called Thomas Brennan, and even just a boy of 12 years old. Cain dismounted in front of the Lucky Dollar, tying his horse to the rail with practiced movements. His boots hit the wooden walkway with solid thuds, spurs jingling softly. He could feel eyes on him, curious glances from the locals trying to size him up, trying to determine if he was the kind of trouble they needed to worry about. He let them look, let them wonder. None of them would recognize the scared boy and the hard man he'd become. Inside the saloon, the air was thick with tobacco smoke and the smell of whiskey and unwashed bodies. The piano player, an old Negro with fingers like gnarled roots, continued his meandering tune without looking up. A handful of men sat at tables, playing cards or nursing drinks, and a couple of saloon girls worked the room with practiced smiles that never reached their eyes. The bartender, a thick man with a handlebar mustache and suspicious eyes, watched Cain approach. "Whiskey," Cain said, his voice rough as gravel, worn smooth by years of silence and smoke. "The good stuff, if you've got it." The bartender poured without comment, sliding the glass across the scarred wood. Cain dropped coins on the bar, more than the drink was worth, and took his glass to a corner table where he could sit with his back to the wall. Old habits, the habits that kept a man breathing in his line of work. He sipped the whiskey and let his gaze wander the room, cataloging faces, noting exits, observing the rhythm of the place. The men at the nearest table were discussing cattle prices and the railroad. The railroad. That's what had brought prosperity to Salvation Ridge, what had transformed it from a dusty stopping point to a real town with real money flowing through it. The railroad brought goods and people, and most importantly, it brought payroll shipments to the bank. Every 2 weeks like clockwork, and tomorrow was payday. Cain had done his homework well. He'd spent the last 3 months tracking the railroad schedule, learning the patterns of the town, understanding the movement of money and men. But his preparation went back further than that. Much further. In truth, he'd been preparing for this for 23 years. Ever since the night they'd forced him from his home with nothing but the clothes on his back and his mother's screams echoing in his ears. A man entered the saloon, and the room shifted subtly, the way water ripples when a stone breaks its surface. He wore a tin star on his vest, and his hand rested casually on the butt of his revolver as he surveyed the room. Sheriff William Harding. Older now, his hair gone gray and his face lined with years, but still recognizable. Still wearing that same badge, still carrying that same authority in his shoulders. Cain's jaw tightened, but he kept his expression neutral, kept his body relaxed. The sheriff's eyes passed over him without interest, just another drifter in a town that saw its share. Harding moved to the bar, exchanged words with the bartender, accepted a drink on the house, and departed as casually as he'd arrived. The whole interaction took less than 3 minutes, but Cain's heart had thundered in his chest the entire time, a wild thing trying to break free from its cage. He remembered the sheriff as a younger man, remembered him standing in the doorway of the Brennan house with a torch in his hand and cold judgment in his eyes. Remembered his voice, flat and final, declaring that Thomas Brennan's father was a thief and a cheat, that the family was being run out of town, that they had until sunrise to be gone or face worse than exile. Remembered his mother pleading, his father's proud silence, his own terrified tears. But that was the boy's memory. Cain Blackwood dealt in colder truths. He finished his whiskey and ordered another, this time taking it even slower, making himself part of the furniture, just another rough character passing through. The saloon girls made their rounds, but he waved them off politely. He wasn't here for comfort or company. He was here for reconnaissance, for that final confirmation that tomorrow would unfold exactly as he needed it to. As the evening deepened into night, more men filtered into the saloon, and the conversations grew louder, fueled by alcohol and the end of a long workday. Cain picked up fragments of talk, pieces of the town's current life. Mayor Douglas Finch was planning improvements to the school. Mrs. Henderson's daughter had gotten herself engaged to a railroad engineer. The Culver brothers had lost 3 head of cattle to rustlers last month. Normal small-town business, the kind of mundane concerns that people built lives around. And then a name cut through the chatter like a knife through silk. Brennan. Cain's attention sharpened, though he gave no outward sign. I'm telling you, that old Brennan property would be perfect for expanding the stockyards. One man said, a portly fellow with sweat stains under his arms despite the evening cool. Been sitting empty since God knows when. Since they ran that family out, I reckon. His companion, a leaner man with a scar across his cheek, shook his head. Won't happen. Finch bought that land years ago, uses it for storage now. Besides, the Brennans were thieves. Good riddance, I say. Town's better off without their kind. Was never proven, was it? The portly man argued, though his tone suggested he didn't really believe his own words. Just accusations from old man Harding and the bank. Proof enough for me. If the sheriff and the banker both say a man's stealing, then he's stealing. James Brennan got what he deserved. Got himself dead is what he got. Heard he died somewhere out in the territories. Him and his wife both, not 6 months after leaving. Left that boy an orphan. The scar man shrugged. Probably better for the kid. Bad blood in that family. Thieves breed thieves. Cain's fingers tightened around his glass until his knuckles went white, but his face remained impassive, a mask carved from stone. He breathed slowly, deeply, letting the rage flow through him and then past him. Rage was useful, but only when controlled, only when channeled into purpose. He'd learned that lesson the hard way. Learned it in the years after his parents had indeed died, exactly as the men had said, broken and defeated in a nameless town 300 miles from everything they'd known. Learned it in the orphanage where he'd been dumped. Learned it in the streets where he'd eventually fled. Learned it in the company of other desperate men who taught him that the world was not kind and justice was a fairy tale told to children. He learned that if you wanted something in this world, you took it. If someone wronged you, you made them pay. And if a town destroyed your family on lies and greed, you came back and you made them remember. You made them all remember. Cain left the saloon as the night was reaching its deepest point, when honest folk were abed, and only the drunks and the desperate remained awake. He walked his horse to the livery, paid for a stall, and took a room at the boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Patterson. She was new to him, must have arrived after his time, and she asked no questions beyond his name and his ability to pay. He gave her a false name, Daniel Cole, and paid for 3 nights in advance. His room was small and spare, a bed with a thin mattress, a washstand with a cracked pitcher, and a window that looked out over the back alley. He didn't bother lighting the lamp. Instead, he stood at the window in the darkness, looking out at the sleeping town, at the place that had been his home and his hell. The memories came whether he wanted them or not, rushing back like a river breaking through a dam. He remembered his father, James Brennan, a proud man who'd worked as a clerk at the bank, handling accounts and records with meticulous care. Remembered his mother, Catherine, who'd taken in sewing and kept their modest home filled with warmth and love. They hadn't been wealthy, but they'd been happy, and young Thomas had never wanted for affection or security. Until the day Sheriff Harding and Mayor Finch, who'd been the bank president then, had come to their door with accusations. Someone had been embezzling from the bank, they said. Money was disappearing from accounts, being siphoned away in amounts small enough to go unnoticed for months. And the only person with access to all the accounts was James Brennan. His father had denied it, of course, had sworn on everything holy that he'd never stolen a penny, that he'd served the bank faithfully for 15 years. But Harding and Finch had evidence, they claimed. Discrepancies in the ledgers, money that had passed through James's hands, witnesses who'd seen him acting suspiciously. The trial had been swift and the verdict predetermined. Guilty, not in a court of law, perhaps, but in the court of public opinion, which in a frontier town was often the only court that mattered. Rather than hang James Brennan or throw him in prison, the town had chosen exile. Pack up and leave, never come back, and consider themselves lucky. It was mercy, they'd said, more than a thief deserved. And Thomas's father, broken by the false accusations and the betrayal of the town he'd served, had gone without fight, had gathered his small family and their few possessions and ridden out into the wilderness like a man already dead. Thomas had looked back as they'd left, had watched Salvation Ridge disappear behind them in the pre-dawn darkness, had seen the torches of the men who'd made sure they actually left. And in that moment, something had broken inside the boy, something innocent and trusting, and something else had grown in its place, something hard and cold and patient. He'd sworn then, in his child's heart, that he would return, that he would make them pay, all of them. And here he was. Cain pulled off his boots and lay down on the bed without undressing, his gun within easy reach on the nightstand. Sleep came in fits and starts, filled with dreams of fire and dust, of his mother's pale face as fever took her, of his father's last words, whispered in the charity hospital where they'd both died within days of each other. It wasn't true, Thomas. I never stole from them. Never. Don't let them make you believe their lies. But the boy had already known, had known from the beginning that his father was innocent, that the accusations were false, constructed by men who'd wanted a scapegoat for their own crimes. He'd just been too young, too powerless to do anything about it. Not anymore. Cain rose with the sun, washed his face in the lukewarm water from the pitcher, and dressed carefully. He checked his weapons, a matched pair of Colt revolvers that he wore in a double rig, and a knife in his boot. Then he went downstairs to the dining room, where Mrs. Patterson served breakfast to her handful of boarders. The meal was simple but filling, eggs and bacon and coffee strong enough to strip rust. The other boarders, a traveling salesman and an old prospector, kept to themselves, and Cain was content to let them. He ate methodically, fueling his body for what was to come, and listened to Mrs. Patterson chatter about town gossip as she refilled coffee cups. Sheriff Harding's getting on in years, she said to no one in particular. His deputy, young Marcus Webb, really does most of the work these days. Not that there's much crime in Salvation Ridge, mind you. We're a peaceful town, law-abiding folk. Oh, certainly we had trouble in the early days, but Mayor Finch and the sheriff cleaned all that up years ago. Made this a proper place to raise children and conduct business. Cain made a non-committal sound, neither agreeing nor disagreeing, and Mrs. Patterson took it as encouragement. Of course, the bank will be busy today. Railroad payroll comes in every other Friday like clockwork. My late husband used to say you could set your watch by the train. Pulls in at 10 in the morning, money's transferred to the bank by 11, and by noon every railroad worker from here to the county line is lined up to get paid. It's quite the production. Sounds like good business for the town, Cain said, his first real contribution to the conversation. Oh my, yes. The bank does very well. And Mayor Finch, he owns the bank now, He's made sure that prosperity is shared throughout the community. New school, improvements to the roads, even talk of bringing in electricity someday. We come a long way from the rough old days. Cain finished his coffee and stood, thanking Mrs. Patterson for the meal. He stepped out into the morning sun, which was already climbing toward its peak, promising another scorching day. The street was coming alive with activity, shopkeepers opening their doors, children running errands, a freight wagon rumbling past loaded with supplies. He made his way back to the livery, where he'd left his horse. The stable boy, a freckled kid of maybe 14, was mucking out stalls and didn't pay Cain much mind beyond a quick greeting. Cain checked his saddlebags, confirming that everything he needed was there, the extra ammunition, the burlap sack, the lengths of rope. He patted his horse's neck, speaking quietly to the animal, and the stallion nickered softly in response. At 9:30, Cain positioned himself in the alley between the general store and a boarded-up building that had once been a dress shop. From this vantage point, he could see the bank's entrance and most of Main Street without being easily observed himself. He rolled a cigarette with steady hands, lit it, and smoked slowly while he watched the town go about its business. At 10 o'clock exactly, the train whistle announced its arrival, a lonely wail that echoed off the surrounding hills. 15 minutes later, Cain watched as a heavily loaded wagon, accompanied by 2 armed guards, made its way from the train depot to the bank. Mayor Finch himself came out to greet them, a prosperous-looking man in a fine suit, his gray hair pomaded back from a round face that spoke of good living and regular meals. He directed the guards inside with the money boxes, standing in the doorway like a king surveying his domain. Cain's lip curled slightly. Douglas Finch, the man who'd orchestrated his father's downfall, who'd needed someone to blame when his own mismanagement and embezzlement had threatened to come to light. It had been elegant, really, in a vicious sort of way. Accuse the honest clerk, manufacture evidence, and use the sheriff as your enforcer. James Brennan had been convenient, trustworthy enough that no one would suspect him until they were told to, and powerless enough that he couldn't effectively fight back. And once the Brennans were gone, Finch had covered his tracks, balanced his books with the money he'd actually stolen, and continued his rise to power. From bank president to mayor, accumulating wealth and respect on the broken backs of the family he destroyed. But Finch had made one mistake. He let the boy live. At 11:15, the guard departed, their job completed. The bank settled into its normal rhythm, with townsfolk coming and going, making deposits and withdrawals, conducting the mundane financial business of daily life. At 11:30, the railroad workers began to arrive, forming a line outside the bank's door, waiting for their turn to collect their pay. Cain watched it all with the patience of a predator. He noted the patterns, the flow of people, the moments when the bank was most crowded and when it emptied out. He watched the sheriff's office, saw Deputy Webb come out and make a lazy circuit of the street before returning to his post. Sheriff Harding didn't appear, likely inside doing paperwork or perhaps napping. An old man resting on the laurels of a reputation built on other people's suffering. At noon, Cain made his move. He left the alley and walked purposefully toward the bank, his hat pulled low and his kerchief now pulled up over the lower half of his face. His hands hung loose at his sides, ready but not threatening, and he timed his approach to coincide with a moment when the line of workers had thinned and the bank was relatively quiet. He pushed through the door, his right hand dropping to his gun. "Everybody stay calm and nobody gets hurt," he announced, his voice carrying clearly through the small space. "This is a robbery." The reaction was immediate. A woman gasped. The bank teller, a thin young man with spectacles, went pale and raised his hands. The 3 customers in the bank, 2 men and the woman who'd gasped, froze in place. And behind the ornate desk in the back of the room, Mayor Finch looked up from his papers with an expression of outraged disbelief. "How dare you?" Finch began, standing up, but Cain cut him off with a gesture of his gun. "Sit down, Mayor. You'll get your turn to talk." Cain moved smoothly, his gun tracking the room, his other hand pulling out the burlap sack from under his duster. He tossed it to the teller. "Fill it up. All the cash from the payroll and whatever else you've got in the drawers. No tricks, no die packs, nothing clever. Just money in the bag." The teller fumbled with the sack, his hands shaking so badly he could barely open the till. "Please, mister, I got a wife and a baby girl. I don't want any trouble." "Then give me what I want, and there won't be trouble," Cain said, his tone almost gentle. He glanced at the customers. "All of you sit down on the floor. Hands where I can see them. This'll be over in a few minutes, and you can all go back to your lives." They complied, moving slowly, and Cain kept his attention split between them and the teller, who was now stuffing bills into the sack with frantic movements. Mayor Finch remained at his desk, his face red with fury, but he'd stopped trying to assert his authority. Good. The man was smart enough to recognize real danger when it was pointing a gun at him. "You're making a mistake," Finch said, his voice tight. "The sheriff will hunt you down. You'll hang for this." "Maybe," Cain allowed. "But right now you're going to sit there quietly, or I might decide this robbery needs to leave no witnesses." "Your choice, Mayor." The threat hung in the air, and Finch's mouth snapped shut. The teller brought the sack to Cain, now bulging with cash. "That's everything, mister. Everything in the tills and the small safe. Please just take it and go." Cain took the sack, hefting it to judge the weight. Had to be close to $15,000, maybe more. A fortune. Enough to disappear into Mexico or South America and live like a king. But money wasn't why he was here. "Now the big safe," Cain said. "The one in the back room. Open it." The teller's eyes went wide. I can't. Only the mayor has the combination." Cain's gun swiveled to point directly at Finch. "Then I guess the mayor better get to work. Unless he wants to see what happens when a bullet and a businessman meet." Finch stood slowly, his face a mask of controlled rage. "You'll never get away with this. They'll catch you before you reach the county line. The safe, Mayor. Now." They moved to the back room, Cain keeping the teller and the customers in his line of sight, while Finch worked the combination on the large floor safe. It took 3 tries, Finch's hands not quite as steady as he'd have liked, but eventually the heavy door swung open. Inside were stacks of bills, neatly bundled and organized, along with property deeds, gold certificates, and other valuable documents. "Load it up," Cain ordered the teller, who'd followed them into the back. "All of it." As the teller worked, Cain spoke again, his voice quiet but carrying clearly. "Tell me, Mayor, do you remember a man named James Brennan?" Finch's head snapped up, his eyes narrowing. "What?" "James Brennan. Worked as a clerk here, about 23 years ago. You accused him of embezzling. Ran him and his family out of town." Something flickered in Finch's expression, a moment of calculation followed by wariness. "I remember. He was a thief. Got what he deserved." "Did he?" Cain pulled down his kerchief, revealing his face fully for the first time. "Take a good look, Mayor. See if you can find a scared 12-year-old boy in this face. See if you can recognize Thomas Brennan." The color drained from Finch's face. His mouth opened and closed without sound, and his eyes widened with dawning horror. "You," he whispered. "You're the boy. But you, they said you died. You disappeared." "I did die," Cain said softly. "Thomas Brennan died in an orphanage in Kansas, died of hunger and cold and despair. But someone else was born from those ashes. Someone who remembered, someone who learned, and someone who always keeps his promises." "Your father was guilty," Finch said, but there was no conviction in his voice now, only growing fear. "The evidence was clear. The evidence you manufactured," Cain corrected. "The evidence you created to hide your own crimes. You needed a scapegoat when your embezzling was about to be discovered, and my father was convenient, honest, trusted, and powerless to defend himself against a bank president and a sheriff. You destroyed my family to save yourself. You killed my parents as surely as if you'd put bullets in them yourself." That's not, you can't prove." "I'm not here to prove anything," Cain interrupted. "I'm here for justice. The justice this town denied my father. The justice that took 23 years to arrive, but arrive it has." The teller had stopped working, staring at Cain with a mixture of fear and something that might have been pity. "Mister, whatever happened back then, robbing this bank won't fix it. It'll just make you a criminal, same as they said your father was. They made me a criminal the day they destroyed my family, Cain said. I'm just living up to their expectations. He gestured with the gun. Finish loading the sack. The teller complied, and soon a second burlap sack was filled with the contents of the safe. Cain estimated he was now carrying close to $40,000, maybe more. It was more than enough. More than enough to hurt the town, to hurt Finch, to make them all feel a fraction of the loss his family had endured. But it still wasn't enough. Money was just money. He needed them to understand. He needed them to acknowledge what had been done. On your feet, Mayor, Cain ordered. You're coming with me. You can't. I can and I am. You're going to walk out of this bank with me, nice and calm. You're going to tell anyone who asks that everything's fine. And then you're going to come with me out of town. Try to signal for help, try to run, try anything at all, and I'll shoot you dead in the street. Understand? Finch nodded stiffly, his face gray with fear. They moved back into the main room, where the customers still sat on the floor. Cain addressed them directly. I'm leaving now. Mayor Finch is coming with me. I want a 10-minute head start before anyone raises the alarm. If I hear pursuit before then, the mayor dies. Cooperate, and he'll be released unharmed once I'm clear. That's the deal. He backed toward the door, keeping his gun trained on the room, the sacks of money slung over his shoulder and his other hand gripping Finch's arm. They stepped out into the bright midday sun, and the street seemed almost surreally normal, people going about their business, unaware that anything unusual had occurred. Walk, Cain ordered, and they moved toward the livery at a measured pace, Finch stumbling slightly, but keeping up. A few townspeople glanced their way, but the mayor forced a smile and a wave, playing his part, too frightened to do otherwise. They reached the livery, and Cain called to the stable boy. I need my horse. Now. The boy, sensing something wrong, but not understanding what, hurried to comply. Within minutes, Cain's black stallion was saddled and ready. He tied the money sacks securely, then forced Finch to mount behind him, binding the mayor's hands with rope. You won't get away with this, Finch hissed. They'll come after you. They'll hunt you down. Let them try, Cain said, and spurred his horse into motion. They rode hard out of town, heading west into the hills, Cain pushing the stallion to its limits. Behind them, he knew, the 10 minutes would expire and all hell would break loose. The bank customers would raise the alarm, the sheriff would be roused, a posse would be formed. But Cain had planned for this, had mapped out his escape route during his months of preparation. He knew these hills, had spent weeks exploring them, finding the hidden paths and the places where a man could disappear if he knew where to look. They rode for an hour, climbing higher into rougher terrain, the town falling away behind them until it was just a smudge in the valley below. Finally, Cain reined in the horse in a small clearing surrounded by rock formations, a place where he could see anyone approaching long before they could reach him. He dismounted and pulled Finch down, the older man landing heavily on his knees. Cain cut the ropes binding Finch's hands, but kept his gun trained on him. Time for that talk I mentioned. Finch rubbed his wrists, tried to regain some composure, some dignity. What do you want from me? An apology? You've already taken the money. You've already made your point. I want the truth, Cain said flatly. I want you to admit what you did. Admit that you framed my father. Admit that you destroyed an innocent family to cover your own crimes. And if I do, if I confess, what then? Will you let me go? Maybe I'll let you walk back to your town and live with the knowledge of what you did. Or maybe I'll put a bullet in you right here and leave you for the buzzards. Either way, I want to hear you say it. Finch was silent for a long moment, his eyes calculating, weighing his options. Then his shoulders sagged, and something seemed to break inside him. Yes, he said quietly. Yes, I did it. I was embezzling from a bank. Have been for years. But the auditors were coming, and I knew they'd find the discrepancies. I needed someone to blame, someone who'd handle the accounts, someone who'd be believed as a thief. Your father was perfect, honest reputation, access to everything, and loyal to a fault. No one would suspect I'd betray him. So, you manufactured evidence. I altered ledgers, created false witnesses, convinced Harding to go along with it. It wasn't hard. The sheriff was more interested in maintaining order than in truth. Running your family out of town was easier than a trial, cleaner than an execution. And once you were gone, I fixed the books, covered my tracks, and continued on as if nothing had happened. While my family died, Cain said, his voice dangerously soft, while my father's good name was destroyed, while my mother wasted away from grief and fever, while I learned to survive in a world that had no mercy for orphans. I didn't mean for them to die, Finch protested weakly. I just needed them gone. I didn't know. You didn't care, Cain corrected. You didn't care what happened to us as long as we couldn't threaten your comfortable life. You built your success on my family's corpses, Mayor. You became rich and respected while we rotted in the wilderness. What do you want me to do? Finch asked, and now there were tears in his eyes, the tears of a coward facing his judgment. I can't bring them back. I can't undo what was done. If you want me to confess publicly, to face trial, I'll do it. Just don't kill me. Please. Cain studied the broken man before him, feeling something hollow and unsatisfied growing in his chest. He'd imagined this moment for so long, had dreamed of making Finch pay, of extracting his pound of flesh. But now that it was here, now that he had the man groveling before him, it felt empty, hollow. The confession changed nothing. His parents were still dead. His childhood was still stolen. And killing Finch wouldn't bring any of it back. But not killing him felt like betrayal too. Felt like letting evil go unpunished. Like spitting on his father's grave. Get up, Cain said finally. We're going back. Back. Finch looked confused. To town. Yes. You're going to confess. You're going to stand in front of the whole town and admit what you did. And then you're going to face whatever justice they decide to give you. If they let you live, fine. If they hang you, fine. But one way or another, the truth is going to come out. They'll never believe me, Finch said, but he was already standing, already accepting the inevitability of it. They'll think I'm just saying whatever you want to hear, that I'm under duress. Maybe, but I got the bank's money, including whatever false records you kept hidden in that safe. I'll bet there's evidence in there, if someone knows what to look for. And once doubt is planted, once people start asking questions, the whole rotten structure will collapse. Trust me, I know how these things work. The truth has a way of coming out, eventually. They mounted the horse again and began the journey back towards Salvation Ridge. The afternoon sun beat down on them, and Cain could taste dust on his tongue, could feel the weight of the stolen money pressing against his back. He'd committed robbery, kidnapping, and a dozen other crimes today. By the letter of the law, he was guilty. But he couldn't bring himself to regret it, couldn't shake the bone-deep certainty that what he'd done was right, or if not right, at least necessary. They were halfway back when Cain spotted the dust cloud rising from the valley below. Riders. A lot of them. The posse had been formed faster than he'd expected, was coming harder than he'd planned for. He reined in the horse, considering his options. He could run, could try to lose them in the hills, could disappear and leave Finch to tell whatever story he wanted. But that meant abandoning his goal, meant letting the truth stay buried. Or he could ride to meet them, could face whatever was coming with his head held high and the truth on his lips. They're coming for you, Finch said unnecessarily. You can still run. Let me go and ride away. They'll chase you, but you might make it. The alternative is a rope. The alternative is justice, Cain said. Real justice, not the kind your town specializes in. He spurred the horse forward, riding down the hill toward the approaching posse. They met on the valley floor, a dozen armed men on horseback, led by Sheriff Harding and his deputy. The sheriff's hand was on his gun, and his face was grim with determination. But when he saw Mayor Finch riding with Cain, alive and apparently unharmed, some of the tension eased from his posture. That's far enough, Harding called out when they were 30 yards apart. Let the mayor go and come peacefully. You're surrounded and outgunned. Don't make this worse than it already is. Cain reined in his horse, his hands raised slightly to show he wasn't reaching for his weapons. Sheriff Harding. Been a long time. The sheriff squinted, trying to place the face. Do I know you? You're the one who forced me and my family out of town 23 years ago. You held the torch while Mayor Finch told the lies. You helped destroy an innocent man because it was easier than seeking the truth. Recognition dawned slowly in Harding's eyes, followed by disbelief. Thomas Brennan? The Brennan boy? But you're dead. You disappeared. I survived. No thanks to you or this town. Cain gestured to Finch. But don't take my word for it. Ask the mayor. Ask him to tell you about James Brennan. Ask him to tell you the truth, for once in his miserable life. All eyes turned to Finch, who sat slumped on the horse, looking older and more defeated than his years. The mayor opened his mouth, closed it, then opened it again. It's true, he said, his voice barely audible. James Brennan was innocent. I framed him. I was the one embezzling from the bank, and I needed someone to take the fall. I chose James because he was convenient and powerless. I destroyed his family to save myself. The posse erupted in shocked murmurs, men looking at each other in confusion and disbelief. Sheriff Harding's face went through a complicated series of expressions, denial warring with dawning horror. You're lying, Harding said finally, but there was no conviction in his voice. He's forcing you to say this. I'm not, Finch said, and now he seemed to find some strength in confession, some relief in finally unburdening himself of the lie he'd carried for decades. I've lived with this guilt for 23 years. I've watched this town prosper on money I stole, on a reputation built on another man's ruin. James Brennan was innocent, and we killed him and his family as surely as if we'd put guns to their heads. And I'm sorry. God help me, I'm sorry. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the wind whistling through the valley and the nervous movements of the horses. The men of the posse looked at each other, looked at their mayor, looked at the hard-faced stranger who'd brought this truth back to haunt them. He's still a criminal, one of the posse members said finally, a burly man with a thick beard. He robbed the bank. He kidnapped the mayor. Whatever happened to his father, that don't give him the right to break the law. Doesn't it? Cain asked quietly. When the law failed him, when the law was used as a weapon against his family. What recourse does a man have then? Where does he go for justice? Not like this, Harding said, but his voice was heavy, weighed down by the knowledge of his own complicity. Not with guns and robbery. There's a process, a system. The same system that exiled my father without trial. The same process that let a guilty man go free while an innocent one was destroyed. Forgive me, Sheriff, if I don't have much faith in your system. So what now? Deputy Webb spoke up for the first time, a young man with earnest eyes and a clear desire to do the right thing. If only he could figure out what that was. What happens now? Do we arrest him? Do we arrest the mayor? Do we just pretend none of this happened and go back to town? Cain dismounted slowly, his hands still visible and non-threatening. He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out the 2 sacks of money, tossing them to the ground at the sheriff's feet. There's your bank money. Every penny I took, plus whatever Finch had hidden away. You can return it to its owners, use it to build that new school Mrs. Patterson mentioned, do whatever you want with it. I don't need it. Never did. Money wasn't the point. Then what was the point? Harding asked. The truth. Recognition. An admission that my father was innocent, that my family was wronged. And I got that. The mayor confessed in front of witnesses. That's more than I dared hope for when I started this. And now, you think you could just ride away? Think we'll let you go after what you did? Cain shook his head slowly. No, I don't think that. I know the law, Sheriff. I broke it, and there's a price for that. I'm prepared to pay it. But I want something in return. I want my father's name cleared. I want it known that James Brennan was innocent, that he died an honest man. Put it in the newspaper. Put it on his grave, if there is one. Make sure everyone knows the truth. And if we don't, if we just hang you and bury this whole mess, then you're the same corrupt lawman who destroyed my family in the first place. And that's something you'll have to live with. But I don't think you will. I think you're a better man than that, Sheriff. Or at least, I think you want to be. Harding sat in his saddle for a long moment, his face working through emotions Cain couldn't read. Finally, he dismounted and walked over to Cain, his hand extended. James Brennan was a good man. I was wrong to help run him out. I was wrong to believe the lies without questioning them. I'll make sure everyone knows the truth. You have my word on that. Cain looked at the offered hand, at the man who'd haunted his nightmares for 2 decades. Then slowly, he reached out and shook it. The gesture felt surreal, like bridging a chasm that shouldn't be crossable. But it also felt like closure, like the final act of a play that had been running for far too long. "I'll come back to town peacefully," Cain said. "I'll face trial for what I did today. No more running, no more hiding. But you make sure that truth comes out, Sheriff. You owe my father that much. You'll get a fair trial," Harding promised. "That's more than we gave him, but it's the best I can offer now." They rode back to Salvation Ridge as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and crimson. Cain rode in the center of the posse, not bound but clearly a prisoner, the black stallion following on a lead rope. Mayor Finch rode separately, guarded by two of the men, looking like he'd aged a decade in the course of a single afternoon. Word had spread through town by the time they arrived, and Main Street was crowded with curious and concerned citizens. They watched in silence as the strange procession made its way to the sheriff's office, whispers rippling through the crowd like wind through wheat. Cain could feel their eyes on him, their judgment, their confusion. But he kept his head high, his expression neutral. He'd done what he came to do. The rest was just epilogue. They put him in a cell, a small barred space that smelled of old sweat and despair. The deputy locked the door with an apologetic expression, and Sheriff Harding pulled up a chair outside the bars. "I'll send word to the circuit judge," Harding said. "Should be here within the week. Until then, you'll be held here. I'll make sure you're treated fairly and that the truth about your father gets out, starting with a full confession from Finch, in writing, witnessed, and notarized." "What'll happen to him?" Cain asked. "That'll be up to the town, I suppose. And maybe the judge. Embezzlement, fraud, false accusation. He'll face charges, that's certain. Whether anyone has the stomach to hang a mayor who's been serving for 20 years, that I can't say. But his life as he knew it is over. That much is guaranteed." "Good enough," Cain said, and meant it. He hadn't come for vengeance, exactly. He'd come for acknowledgement, for the setting right of an old wrong. And he'd gotten it, even if the price was his own freedom. The days that followed were strange. The town buzzed with the revelation like a kicked hornet's nest. The newspaper, a small weekly publication run by an editor named Williamson, printed a special edition detailing the confession of Mayor Finch and the exoneration of James Brennan. The story spread through Salvation Ridge and beyond, carried by travelers and telegraph operators to neighboring towns and territories. People came to visit Cain in his cell, people who'd known his father, who remembered the Brennan family. Some came to apologize, others simply to stare at the ghost who'd returned from the past. A few brought food or books, small gestures of sympathy or guilt. Cain accepted them all with quiet grace, neither embracing their kindness nor rejecting it. Mrs. Patterson came, her eyes red from crying. "I didn't know," she said through the bars. "I wasn't here back then, but I heard the story, the version they told. If I'd known the truth, if any of us had known." "It's done," Cain told her gently. "Can't change the past. Can only acknowledge it and try to do better going forward." The circuit judge arrived on schedule, a gray-haired man named Thornton with a reputation for fairness and a no-nonsense approach to frontier justice. He held court in the town hall, with most of Salvation Ridge in attendance. The trial lasted 2 days. Mayor Finch testified first, repeating his confession in full legal detail, explaining how he'd embezzled the funds, how he'd framed James Brennan, how he'd enlisted Sheriff Harding's unwitting help in the exile. His testimony was devastating, each word another nail in the coffin of his reputation and his freedom. He was arrested on the spot, charged with multiple counts of embezzlement, fraud, and obstruction of justice. He'd face his own trial in due course. It was Cain's turn. He didn't deny what he'd done, didn't try to minimize or excuse it. He'd robbed the bank at gunpoint, had kidnapped the mayor, had threatened violence. All of that was true, but he also told the story of his family, of the injustice that had set him on this path, of the years of suffering and survival that had led him back to Salvation Ridge. His lawyer, a young man appointed by the court, argued for leniency based on the extraordinary circumstances. He painted Cain as a victim himself, driven to desperate measures by the complete failure of the justice system that should have protected his family. It was a compelling argument, and Cain could see it resonating with some members of the jury. But he could also see the harder faces, the ones that believed the law was the law regardless of circumstance, that robbery was robbery no matter the justification. In the end, the verdict was guilty on all counts, but with a recommendation for mercy. Judge Thornton took his time with the sentencing, his expression grave as he looked down from his bench at the man standing before him. Thomas Brennan, known as Cain Blackwood, Thornton began, his voice carrying clearly through the packed hall. You have been found guilty of armed robbery, kidnapping, and assault. These are serious crimes that normally carry severe penalties, including the possibility of death by hanging. However, this court recognizes the extraordinary circumstances that led to your actions. This court recognizes that you were the victim of a grievous injustice, that your family was destroyed by the very people who should have been upholding the law. This court recognizes that you returned the stolen money willingly and came to trial peacefully. And this court recognizes that your actions, while criminal, have exposed a long-standing corruption and brought truth to light. The judge paused, letting his words sink in. Therefore, I sentence you to 10 years in the territorial prison, with the possibility of parole after 5 years, contingent on good behavior. This sentence is lenient given the crimes, but I believe it serves justice better than a harsher punishment would. You will have time to reflect, to consider whether vengeance served you better than forgiveness might have, and to decide what kind of man you want to be when you emerge. May God have mercy on your soul. 10 years. It was more than Cain had hoped for, less than he'd feared. He accepted the sentence with a nod, feeling oddly relieved that the whole thing was finally over. The not knowing had been worse than the knowing, the waiting harder than the resolution. They took him away in chains 2 days later, loaded him onto a prison wagon along with 3 other convicted men. Sheriff Harding came to see him off, looking older and more worn than he had even a week earlier. For what it's worth, Harding said quietly, I'm sorry. I'm sorry I didn't question Finch's accusations. I'm sorry I didn't protect your family. I'm sorry I helped destroy an innocent man. I'll carry that with me for the rest of my life. Good, Cain said, not unkindly. Maybe it'll make you a better lawman. Maybe it'll make you think twice before you accept the convenient truth over the actual truth. Already has, Harding admitted. Already has. The wagon rolled out of Salvation Ridge as the sun climbed toward its peak, leaving the town behind in a cloud of dust. Cain looked back once, taking in the familiar buildings, the streets he'd walked as a boy and returned to as a man. It looked different now, smaller somehow, less significant. It was just a town, just a collection of buildings and people, no more or less important than any other spot on a vast frontier. But it was also the place where his story had begun and ended, where his family had been destroyed and ultimately vindicated. And that meant something, even if he couldn't quite define what. The years in prison were hard, but not unbearable. Cain kept to himself mostly, didn't make enemies, didn't cause trouble. He worked in the prison quarry, breaking rocks under the merciless sun, and in the evenings he read whatever books he could get his hands on. He learned that Sheriff Harding had retired, that Deputy Webb had taken over and was running the office with integrity and fairness. He learned that Mayor Finch had been sentenced to 15 years for his crimes and was serving time in a different prison. He learned that Salvation Ridge had erected a small memorial to James Brennan in the town square, acknowledging the wrong that had been done and the innocent man who'd suffered for it. And he learned, slowly, that revenge hadn't healed him. It had given him closure, yes, and satisfaction, and a sense of justice served. But it hadn't brought his parents back, hadn't erased the pain of his childhood, hadn't made him whole. That healing, if it was possible at all, would have to come from somewhere else. He was released after 7 years, 2 years off his sentence for good behavior and for helping to stop a prison riot that might have turned deadly. He walked out of the prison gates on a spring morning with a small bag of belongings, $47 in his pocket, and no clear idea of where to go or what to do next. He didn't go back to Salvation Ridge. There was nothing there for him anymore, no unfinished business, no scores to settle. The town had acknowledged its crime, had made what amends it could, and he'd paid his own price for the crimes he'd committed in response. The account was balanced, the books closed. Instead, he drifted, taking work where he could find it. Honest work this time, ranch hand and freight guard and occasional carpenter. He let the name Cain Blackwood fade away, reclaiming the name Thomas Brennan, wearing it like a man, putting on an old coat, and finding it still fits, if not comfortably, then at least familiarly. He never married, never settled in one place too long. The wandering life suited him, kept him moving, kept him from putting down roots that might strangle him. But he wasn't running anymore, wasn't driven by rage or the need for vengeance. He was just living one day at a time, carrying his past with him, but not letting it define his future. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the sun set like blood on the horizon, he'd think about his parents, about the town that had wronged them and the justice that had finally, imperfectly, been served. He'd think about the price of truth and the cost of revenge, about the line between justice and vengeance, and about whether he'd crossed it or merely walked it. He never came to a firm conclusion. Some questions he realized didn't have clean answers. Some wounds never fully healed. And some stories didn't end so much as they just stopped, leaving the characters to figure out the rest on their own. But he'd kept his promise. He'd made them remember. He'd made them acknowledge the truth. And his father's name, James Brennan, had been cleared, carved into stone in the town square for all to see and know. Innocent man, wrongly accused, destroyed by lies, and finally vindicated by his son's desperate, dangerous, and ultimately successful quest for truth. That would have to be enough, because it was all he had, all he'd ever have. The past couldn't be changed, the dead couldn't be resurrected, and justice was always imperfect, always incomplete. But truth mattered, recognition mattered, acknowledgement mattered, and Thomas Brennan, once known as Cain Blackwood, the outlaw who robbed his own town, rode on into the sunset of his life, knowing that at least he'd achieved that much, that his family's suffering hadn't been forgotten, that the lies had finally been exposed, and that somewhere, somehow, his father's spirit could rest a little easier knowing that the truth had won out in the end. The dust settled behind him as he rode, and the frontier stretched out ahead, vast and indifferent and full of possibility. And that, perhaps, was the only redemption any of them could hope for, the only justice the West had ever offered, the knowledge that tomorrow was coming whether you were ready or not, and you could either face it with courage or turn away in fear. Thomas Brennan rode toward tomorrow, his past behind him and his future uncertain, but his conscience finally, blessedly, at peace.